July the 31st, 2026, Houston, Texas. My wonderful student Earl, 13 years old. He was in my homeschool program. He's currently in Thailand and coming back from my summer camp. He's doing wonderful research. We are shooting for Oxford and Cambridge. So his research supposed to be Oxford level. Let's see. Earl, the floor is yours. Impress us. Go ahead.
So yeah, my essay is going to be why did the Soviet Union lose the Cold War? So in this essay, I'm just going to be explaining my thesis first and moving on to several things that contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union, talking about how certain leaders and certain policies and doctrines led to the fall of the USSR. So the Soviet Union lost the Cold War because of a combination of internal weaknesses and external competition. While problems such as a weak economy, political corruption, growing nationalism, and Gorbachev's reforms made the Soviet Union unstable from within, pressure from the United States and its allies through the arms race, the war in Afghanistan, and Western political and economic influence made these weaknesses even worse. The policies of Soviet leaders from Nikita Khrushchev to Mikhail Gorbachev also played a significant role, as each leader either failed to solve the Soviet Union's problems or unintentionally made them worse. Therefore, it was not one single cause that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead, the Soviet Union fell because internal problems weakened the country, while external competition pushed it beyond the point where it could no longer recover. So for the rest of my essay, I'll analyze under every leader what they did to impact and cause USSR to be pushed to the brink of dissolving and how they did it. Now, to choose the first leader is after post-World War II, which is Stalin. But to first talk about the Cold War, we must first talk about World War II and what shaped the Cold War as a whole. During World War II, he was the one to invade Berlin and take back all of its land and was the main contributory in the war. Once the Paris peace treaties were signed, he created a huge communist region, which split one of the most influential continents of the time in half. Once the Truman Doctrine was established, he did many things to stop Western influence and instigate the Cold War, Korean War. One of the many things to preserve his communist regime was to blockade Berlin and start the first nuclear arms race by testing the first Soviet atomic bomb. Due to his early death, Due to his early death in the Cold War, there isn't really much to talk about during this Cold War period. But he laid the foundation for internal weakness by doing frequent purges and having a very queasy case of political paranoia. Now, many of the Soviet Union's internal weaknesses developed over several decades under Nikita Khrushchev from 1953 to 1964. The Soviet Union experienced important changes after the death of Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev introduced de-Stalinization through his 1956 secret speech, expelling Stalin's crimes and reducing political repression. Although this improves some aspects of Soviet society, it also weakens people's confidence in the Communist Party because many began questioning the system itself. Khrushchev also attempted economic reforms, including the Virgin Lands campaign to increase agricultural production. While these reforms showed promise at first, they ultimately failed to solve long-term food shortages and economic inefficiency. At the same time, Cold War crises such as the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis increased tensions with the United States, forcing the Soviet Union to continue spending heavily on defense instead of improving their own economy in the first place. Khrushchev's reforms demonstrated that the Soviet system needed change, but they failed to address its deeper structural weaknesses. Now, the Soviet economy continued to decline under Leonid Brezhnev, 1964 to 1982. His leadership became known as the era of stagnation because economic growth slowed dramatically. The centrally planned economy became increasingly inefficient. Factories produced low-quality goods, and shortages of consumer products became common. Workers had little motivation to improve productivity because wages did not depend on performance. While corruption spread throughout the Communist Party, instead of introducing major reforms, Brezhnev focused on maintaining stability and expanding Soviet military power. Larger amounts of government spending were directed toward competing with the United States in the nuclear arms race, leaving fewer resources to improve the economy or raise living standards. Although the Soviet Union appeared strong internally it was becoming economically weaker every year. Brezhnev's decision to invade Afghanistan in 1979 further damaged the Soviet Union. The war lasted nearly 10 years and became the Soviet Union's equivalent of the Vietnam War. It cost billions of rubles. It resulted in the deaths of around 15,000 Soviet soldiers, and placed additional strain on an already struggling economy. The United States and its allies supplied Afghan resistance fighters with weapons and financial assistance, increasing the cost of the war for the Soviet Union. The conflict also became deeply unpopular among Soviet citizens and damaged confidence in communist leadership. Afghanistan showed how external competition made existing internal weaknesses even worse. Following Brezhnev's death, Yuri Andropov in 1982 and 1984 recognized that corruption and economic efficiency were serious problems. He actually attempted to improve worker discipline and reduce corruption within the Communist Party. However, his poor health meant he died before meaningful reforms could be introduced. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, 1984 to 1985, largely continued Brezhnev's policies and introduced almost no significant reform. Because both leaders remained in power for only short periods, the Soviet Union continued to experience economic decline, while necessary changes were delayed. The final Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, 1985 to 1991, attempted the most significant reforms in Soviet history. Through perestroika, he tried to restructure the economy by introducing limited market reforms. While Glasnost encouraged greater freedom of speech and reduced censorship, he also introduced democracia, allowing more competitive elections and increasing political participation. Gorbachev hoped these reforms would modernize socialism and strengthen the Soviet Union. Instead, they exposed decades of corruption, economic failure, and government efficiency. As censorship was reduced, Soviet citizens openly criticized the Communist Party. The reason why was because they realized that the Western world had higher living standards and were earning much more money. That that led to that led to nationalist movements in republics such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, and Georgia demanded independence. Gorbachev also chose not to use military force to prevent Eastern European countries from abandoning communism, leading to the revolutions of 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Although his reforms were intended to save the Soviet Union, they actually accelerated its collapse because the weakened this week, they weakened the government's control before the economy had recovered, and the economy was bad enough that the Soviet citizens realized that the Soviet Union was just collapsing. External competition throughout the Cold War also played a major role in the Soviet Union's defeat. The arms race with the United States placed enormous financial pressure on the Soviet economy. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers spent vast amounts developing nuclear weapons and advanced military technology. During the 1980s, the administration of Ronald Reagan dramatically increased American defense spending and introduced a strategic defense initiative. Although the Soviet Union attempted to keep pace, its weaker economy could not match American military expenditure. The arms race therefore magnified the Soviet Union's existing economic problems and forced the government to spend money it desperately needed elsewhere. Western pressure extended beyond military competition also. The United States and Western Europe demonstrated the success of capitalist economies through higher living standards, greater consumer choice, and more political freedoms. Greater broadcast, television, and increased contact with the West allowed many Soviet citizens to compare their own lives with those in Western countries. Economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and competition in technology also placed additional strain on the Soviet system. These external pressures did not create the Soviet Union's problems, but they made it much more difficult for the communist government to actually solve them. Nationalism became the first internal factor that brought the Soviet Union to the end. The Soviet Union consisted of 15 republics with different cultures, languages, and national identities. As Gorbachev introduced greater openness and reduced the use of force, many republics demanded independence. The Baltic states were among the first to break away, followed by others across the Soviet Union. Without the support of these republics, the Soviet Union could no longer function as a unified state. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. Overall, the Soviet Union lost the Cold War because of both internal weaknesses and external competition. Every Soviet leader, from Khrushchev to Gorbachev, inherited serious problems and struggled to solve them. Economic decline, political corruption, nationalism, and unsuccessful reforms steadily weakened the Soviet Union from within. While the arms race, the war in Afghanistan, and sustained Western pressure intensified these weaknesses. Also, the Soviet citizens realizing that capitalism was actually a much better way of living. Neither internal nor external factors alone fully explain why the Soviet Union collapsed. Instead, it was a combination of both of long-term domestic failures and relentless international competition that caused the Soviet Union to lose the Cold War and ultimately collapse in 1991. That is my thesis, and my whole thesis is that both Western competition and internal domestic problems led to the dissolve of the Soviet Union. Thank you.